Mark Renner had lived in Alder Creek his whole life, and most days felt exactly the same. The town was quiet, peaceful, and almost too familiar. People said Alder Creek was the kind of place where nothing surprising ever happened, and that was mostly true except for the cabin on Pine Ridge Road, the one Mark inherited from his grandfather. Everyone in town had a story about that cabin, but none of them matched. Some said it was haunted, some said Mark's grandfather kept strange old boxes in the attic, and others said the cabin was built on old land that held secrets. Mark never confirmed any of the stories because, truthfully, he didn't know the whole truth himself. He worked as a school bus mechanic at the town garage, fixing the same engines, greeting the same people, and living the same quiet routine. When he came home in the evenings, the cabin looked the same too: weathered wood, tall pine trees, the soft sound of the wind. Mark liked its quietness. It felt safe, even if the past hung in the air like dust that had never been wiped away. Most people in Alder Creek knew Mark as dependable and quiet, the kind of man who helped neighbors fix their fences or clear snow from their driveways without being asked. But they also knew he kept to himself. There were no late-night visitors, no loud parties, no drama, and that was how Mark liked it, at least until the day Sarah Holt returned to town. Sarah had been one of Mark's closest friends during childhood. They had grown up just a few houses apart, riding bikes through the forest and sharing snacks at school. She had always been the bold one, talking fast, laughing loudly, and dreaming of leaving Alder Creek to see the world. But when she left suddenly after graduation, without saying goodbye, Mark had been confused for years. She never wrote, never called. Eventually, he accepted she had moved on with her life somewhere far away. So when she suddenly reappeared one cloudy afternoon, standing at the edge of the garage with a small, nervous smile, Mark felt time freeze. She looked different, older, calmer, and carrying something heavy in her eyes. But she was still Sarah, the girl who used to race him to the creek and always let him win. Mark felt the past rush back before he could stop it. "Hi, Mark," she said softly, as if she wasn't sure she had the right to say his name after all these years. Mark wiped his hands on a cloth and walked over. "Sarah, I didn't think you'd ever come back." I didn't either," she admitted. "But I need to talk to you. It's important." There was something in her voice that made Mark's stomach tighten. It wasn't just sadness, it was fear. Not the kind that makes someone run, but the kind that makes someone stop in their tracks because they don't know what will happen next. Mark nodded slowly. "All right, where do you want to talk?" She hesitated for a moment before answering. "Your cabin." Mark blinked in surprise. Hardly anyone asked to go there. Many people avoided it completely. Why the cabin? High with the kumsum. I with the cabin. High with the common. I with the cabin. She looked down at her shoes, twisting her fingers together. "Because what I need to tell you, it has to do with your grandfather." The words sent a strange chill through Mark. His grandfather, Harland Renner, had been a quiet, private man, respected by some and avoided by others. He passed away when Mark was young, leaving behind more questions than memories. Mark had always believed his grandfather simply valued privacy, but there were moments: old journals, sealed boxes, strange visitors that hinted at a deeper story. Mark tried not to think about it too much. Mark cleared his throat. "All right, let's go." They drove separately, and as Mark's truck climbed the hill toward the cabin, he kept glancing in his mirror to make sure Sarah was still behind him. She followed closely, her headlights steady but her expression unreadable. Mark felt strange, nervous, curious, and slightly afraid of the answers waiting for him. When they arrived, the cabin looked as it always did, simple, quiet, and wrapped in tall trees that seemed to guard it. Sarah paused at the door, lightly touching the old wooden frame as if remembering something. Mark noticed her hand trembled just a little. Inside, the cabin smelled of cedar and old paper. Sunlight slipped through the windows, catching dust in the air. Sarah walked slowly around the room, stopping near the old bookshelf filled with faded journals that once belonged to Mark's grandfather. "I used to wonder what was inside those books," she said quietly. Mark nodded. "Me too." Sarah took a deep breath and faced him. "Mark, I found something." Her words made his heart beat faster. She reached into her bag and pulled out a small bundle of old letters tied with a thin piece of ribbon. The envelopes were yellowed with age. The writing faint, but still readable. Mark recognized the handwriting instantly. It was his grandfather's. "Where did you get these?" Mark asked, his voice shaky. Sarah swallowed. "My aunt kept them. She said they were important, but she never explained why. When she passed away last month, I found them in a box of things she left for me." Mark stared at the letters. He felt excitement and dread mixing together. "I read them," she continued softly. "And they talk about Alder Creek. About things that happened here a long time ago. Things people don't know. Things your grandfather tried to hide." Mark looked up. Her eyes were filled with worry. "Why bring them to me?" "Because you deserve to know," she whispered. "And because I can't carry this alone." Mark slowly pulled one letter from the stack. His hands shook slightly as he opened it. The first lines mentioned land disputes, missing documents, and a decision made by the town's founder, a man everyone loved and spoke about with pride. The letter hinted that the founder's decisions were not as noble as the history books claimed. Mark's heart pounded as he continued reading. His grandfather had written about a mistake. Something he regretted, but could not undo. Words like burden, truth, and responsibility appeared again and again in the letters. Mark looked up at Sarah, confused and overwhelmed. "Why didn't you come sooner? Why tell me now?" Her voice dropped to almost a whisper. "Because once you open this door, you can't close it again. Mark, this could change everything you know about your family, and everything the town believes about itself." He tried to steady his breathing. The cabin suddenly felt too small, the air too heavy. "Sarah," he said quietly, "what exactly are these letters saying?" She hesitated, her eyes filling with emotion. For a moment she looked younger again, like the girl he used to know, the one who'd run barefoot through the fields and laugh until she cried. But now her expression held something much deeper. "They say the story Alder Creek tells about its beginning isn't true," she said. "Your grandfather helped keep the truth hidden." Mark felt the room tilt slightly, as if the floor itself wasn't steady anymore. It was a strange feeling, learning something that made everything familiar suddenly feel uncertain. Sarah stepped closer. "I didn't want to come here. I didn't want to be the one to tell you this. But after reading these letters, I couldn't pretend I didn't know. I thought maybe you could help me understand what it all means." Mark looked at her for a long moment. He could hear his own heartbeat in the silence. The cabin felt different now, as though it had been waiting for this moment. Waiting for someone to uncover what had been hidden for years. He set the letter down slowly. "Sarah," he said, "we're not just talking about old stories. This could change the entire town." She nodded, her voice barely audible. "I know. That's why I was afraid to come." Mark exhaled, long and slow. He looked around the cabin, at the walls that held decades of secrets, at the journals his grandfather left behind. Suddenly, everything made sense in a way it never had before. The whispers, the rumors, the uneasy silence when people mentioned his grandfather. It all connected. He looked at Sarah again. "We'll figure it out. Together." She gave a small, relieved smile. But behind her eyes, the fear was still there, the fear of what the truth might reveal, and how their quiet little town would react once it learned that its history wasn't as perfect as it believed. The world outside the cabin remained peaceful and still, unaware that inside, two people had just opened the first door to a story that would shake Alder Creek to its core. Sarah stood near the window of the cabin, gently touching the edge of the curtain as if it helped her keep steady. The air between her and Mark felt heavy, like a moment stretched too far. Mark still had the letters in his hands, his eyes moving over the old handwriting again and again. Every word made him feel something new: confusion, surprise, worry, and something deeper he could not fully name. Sarah finally spoke in a quiet tone. "There's more I didn't show you yet." Mark looked up sharply. "More?" She nodded. her fingers tightening around the strap of her bag. The letters were only the beginning. I found a journal, too. Written by your grandfather. It explains things the letters only hint at. Mark felt his breath catch. His grandfather's voice had been distant in his memory for so long that reading his words felt like hearing him again. Where is it? I didn't bring it, she admitted softly. I wasn't sure if I should. It felt too important to just carry around, but I copied parts of it. She reached into her bag again, pulling out a small notebook filled with pages of handwriting. Her handwriting. She had carefully written every word she thought Mark needed to see. Mark took the notebook gently. You rewrote all this? She nodded. I wanted you to understand without feeling overwhelmed all at once. He opened the notebook, his eyes landing on one sentence she had copied exactly as written. The truth is not lost, it is buried. And I fear someone will uncover it one day. Mark read the line again. The words felt heavy, like his grandfather had known this moment would come. He looked up and found Sarah watching him with a mixture of sympathy and fear. I don't understand, Mark whispered. Why would he write something like this? What was he hiding? Sarah took a small step forward. Your grandfather wasn't a bad person, Mark, but he made choices he didn't know how to undo. He helped the founder of this town hide mistakes. Big ones. Things that could have changed everything. Mark closed the notebook, pressing his hand on the cover. Why didn't he come forward? Why didn't he tell anyone before he passed? Because some truths feel too heavy to share, Sarah said gently. Maybe he thought he was protecting people. Mark felt torn between wanting to defend his grandfather and wanting to uncover everything at once. The struggle made his chest feel tight. He walked toward the fireplace, staring at the old stones that had been there since long before he was born. Sarah, he said slowly, when you read these letters, when you found that journal, what did you feel? She looked surprised at the question but answered honestly. At first, I felt confused, then sad, then scared. I didn't want to believe it. The town we grew up in, the stories we heard in school about how Alder Creek was built, how everyone worked together, how the founder was this perfect leader. Suddenly it didn't match anymore. It felt like the ground under my feet wasn't as solid as I thought. Mark nodded. He felt the same way. Everything familiar now felt uncertain, and when I realized your grandfather was part of it, she continued, I wasn't angry. I knew you needed to know. You deserved to understand your family's history. I couldn't keep it quiet. Mark turned to face her. But why come to me now? After all these years of not talking? Sarah lowered her head. Because my aunt. She wanted me to give you those letters. She said she had promised someone a long time ago. When I found them after she passed, I knew it was time. Mark blinked. She left them for you to bring to me? Yes, Sarah said. She said the truth belongs to the people who can handle it. And she believed you were one of those people. Mark swallowed hard. He had never seen himself as someone meant to carry something important, but hearing it said aloud made something inside him shift. Sarah, he began. She lifted her eyes to him. There's something else I need to tell you. Mark felt a new wave of tension. What is it? She hesitated, looking as if she was deciding whether to speak or stay silent. Her voice dropped to a gentle whisper. When I first realized what the journal said, I wanted to leave the town again. I didn't want to get involved. I didn't want this responsibility. So when I came to your cabin today, I almost turned back. Mark stepped closer. Why didn't you? She looked right into his eyes. Because I remembered who you were. Even as kids, you always did the right thing. Even when it was hard. And I thought, maybe you would know what to do now. Her honesty made Mark's heart feel warm and heavy at the same time. He didn't feel worthy of her belief, but he appreciated it more than he could say. He took a slow breath. You shouldn't have to carry this alone. Her gaze softened, and for the first time since she arrived, she seemed to relax just a little. Thank you, Mark. They stood there for a quiet moment, both processing the weight of what they had begun. Then Sarah walked toward the bookshelf, running her hand over the dusty spines of the old journals Mark had rarely touched. Do you think there's more hidden here? She asked. He looked toward the far wall, remembering something his grandfather had once said, something about keeping important things close but out of sight. There might be. They searched together. Sarah checked the shelves while Mark examined the desk. After a while, Sarah knelt near the fireplace and gently tapped one of the stones. Mark, listen. He knelt beside her. When she tapped again, the hollow sound echoed lightly. Mark's heart raced, not with fear, but with the thrill of discovery. There's something behind it. Sarah looked at him with a mixture of excitement and nervousness. Do you think we should open it? Mark hesitated. A deep part of him whispered that this moment was important, that whatever they found might change everything even more than the letters had. But another part reminded him of Sarah's trembling voice earlier when she said, "Don't make this harder." He remembered how her words weren't meant to stop him, they were meant to prepare him. He took a slow breath. If there's something hidden here, then it's meant to be found. Sarah nodded, trusting him more than her expression could hide. Together, they gently worked the stone loose until it shifted. Behind it was a small, dust-coated wooden box. Sarah covered her mouth in surprise. Oh my, Mark, look! He carefully pulled the box out. It wasn't heavy, but it felt meaningful, like it had waited a long time for this moment. What do you think is inside? She whispered. Mark looked at her quietly. Only one way to know. He slowly lifted the lid. Inside were folded pages, small objects, and something wrapped in cloth. Everything looked old, but perfectly preserved. Sarah leaned in closer. Her breath caught in her throat. Your grandfather kept this hidden all these years, she said softly. Why? Mark could feel it. This wasn't just evidence. It was a message, a story unfinished, something his grandfather could not bring himself to speak out loud. He gently removed the first folded page, but before he could read it, Sarah touched his arm lightly and whispered, Mark, whatever we find next, promise me we face it together. Mark looked into her eyes and nodded. I promise. And in that quiet cabin, where secrets had slept for decades, they began the journey that would soon shake not only their lives but the entire town of Alder Creek. Mark held the first folded page from the wooden box, as if it were something fragile, something that might fall apart if he breathed too hard. The paper was old, slightly yellow, and carried a faint smell of cedar, like it had been waiting quietly in the darkness behind the fireplace stone for many years. Sarah sat beside him on the small rug, her knees pulled close, watching him with careful eyes. Even though she tried to stay calm, Mark could see the curiosity in her face and the slight tremble in her hands. Go ahead, she whispered gently. Read it. Mark nodded slowly and unfolded the paper. The handwriting was familiar, his grandfather's, with its neat curves and careful spacing. It almost felt strange to see it again, as if his grandfather had just written the note yesterday. The letter began with a simple greeting, but as Mark read further, his expression shifted. His grandfather wrote about the early years of Alder Creek, about how the town's founder had struggled to keep people hopeful during the difficult times. But then the letter took a new direction. Speaking of decisions made in secret, land agreements that were not fair, and records that were quietly taken away so people would not question them. Mark read silently for a long moment, feeling the weight of each word. Finally, he lowered the paper. He knew, Mark said softly. He knew everything that was hidden. Sarah leaned closer. What else does it say? Mark read a few more lines. It says he planned to tell someone one day, but he couldn't. He was afraid people would misunderstand. Sarah's eyes softened. Your grandfather cared about this town. Maybe he didn't know how to share the truth without causing confusion. Mark sighed. Or maybe he didn't think anyone would listen. Sarah gently touched the edge of the paper. But now someone is listening. You are. Those words hit Mark deeply. He looked around the cabin, at the walls that had held his grandfather's secrets for so long. It felt strange to imagine the man he admired, struggling with such heavy choices. Mark had always pictured him as calm and wise, but now he saw another side, a man who carried a secret that grew heavier with time. Mark reached into the box and pulled out another item, a small journal, its cover worn and its pages filled with neat handwriting. He opened it slowly while Sarah leaned closer. "Is this the missing part of the story?" Sarah asked softly. Mark nodded. "Looks like it." The journal was filled with entries from decades earlier. His grandfather had written about meetings with the founder, conversations that happened late at night, and moments when he considered speaking up, but lost the courage. There were also notes about the land and people who lived on it before the town was built, people whose stories had never been told in public. As Mark turned the pages, he felt his chest tighten. There was so much he wanted to say. He wrote about it again and again. "He trusted you to find this someday," Sarah said gently. "He must have believed you would understand." Mark closed the journal and stared at the fireplace. The soft flicker of light made the room feel warmer. But his thoughts remained tangled. He had spent his whole life believing Alder Creek was built on hard work and honesty. Now he understood there was another layer, one that very few people ever knew. Sarah watched him for a moment, then asked softly, "Mark, what are you thinking?" He hesitated. "I'm thinking, this isn't just about my grandfather or the founder. It's about everyone in this town. People believe in the story they were told. If we reveal something different, everything could change." Sarah nodded slowly. "I know. But is it right to hide the truth just because it feels easier?" Mark looked at her with honest confusion. "I don't know. That's what scares me." Sarah gave him a small, encouraging smile. "The truth might be uncomfortable, but it can also help people understand their past better." Mark sighed and ran a hand through his hair. "I wish my grandfather had told me himself. Maybe then I wouldn't feel so lost." Sarah tilted her head gently. "Maybe he wanted to tell you, but he didn't know when. Or maybe he hoped you would find the truth when you were ready." Her words brought a calmness to the room. Mark didn't say anything for a moment, but he felt her presence supporting him. He realized that even though this secret was big and confusing, he didn't have to face it alone. After a long silence, Sarah said quietly, "There's one more thing in the box." Mark reached inside and pulled out a cloth-wrapped object. When he unwrapped it, he found an old key, simple, silver-colored, and smooth from use. "What do you think this unlocks?" Sarah asked, leaning closer. "I'm not sure," Mark whispered. "But if my grandfather hid it, it must be related to everything else." Sarah picked up one of the folded papers and pointed to a short note written on the corner, "For the room beneath the floor." She looked at Mark with wide eyes. "Do you think he meant a hidden room?" Mark raised his brow in surprise. "I've lived here for years. I never found anything like that." Sarah stood up and walked to the center of the room. "Maybe you weren't looking." Mark joined her, and together they tapped the wooden floor gently. Most of it sounded solid, but near the old rocking chair, there was a slightly hollow sound. Mark knelt down and pressed his hand against the floorboards. The wood felt different, almost thinner. Sarah knelt beside him. "Try the key." Mark slid the key along the edges of the floorboard until he found a small metal latch hidden near the corner. The key fit perfectly. When he turned it softly, the floorboard loosened and lifted slightly, revealing a small wooden door about the size of a suitcase. Sarah drew in a quiet breath. "Mark, this is it." "See, Adamen." Mark slowly lifted the small door. Beneath it was a narrow staircase leading downward into darkness. It didn't look frightening, more like an old storage space, but it felt important, connected to every secret his grandfather had kept. "Should we go down?" Sarah asked gently. Mark looked at her. "Only if you want to." She nodded with steady eyes. "We started this together. We should continue together too." Her words gave Mark strength. He reached for the lantern hanging on the wall and lit it carefully. The warm glow filled the room, making the hidden staircase look less mysterious and more inviting. As Mark stepped onto the first wooden stair, Sarah followed close behind. The air smelled old but calm, like time had been sleeping peacefully in this place. The light touched the walls, revealing shelves filled with old boxes, rolled papers, and carefully stored items his grandfather must have placed there many years ago. "This isn't just storage," Sarah whispered. "This looks like a private archive." Mark nodded. He kept everything he thought mattered. They walked slowly around the hidden room, examining labels, notes, and objects that told the deeper story of Alder Creek. Every step made Mark feel closer to understanding his grandfather's heart. And every discovery reminded him how careful and thoughtful the old man had been. Sarah eventually touched Mark's arm gently. "Do you feel ready to share this with the town someday?" Mark looked around the small hidden room, then at Sarah's steady expression. "I don't know if I'm ready," he said honestly. "But I know I have to be brave. And I know I don't want to face this alone." Sarah smiled softly. "You won't." Their eyes met with a deep sense of trust, and in that moment, Mark felt something shift inside him, not fear, not confusion, but a quiet courage. The truth was bigger than he expected, but he wasn't alone anymore. Together, they would understand it, piece by piece. They stood in the soft lantern light, surrounded by the past, knowing the choices they made next would shape not only their lives but the future of the entire town. The days that followed felt different for Mark. Every morning when he woke up in the cabin, he felt the same mix of excitement and responsibility. The hidden room beneath the floor had changed everything. It was no longer just a cabin he lived in, it had become a doorway into a deeper truth about Alder Creek. A truth that had been hidden for decades. And although the discovery filled him with questions, it also gave him a quiet strength he had never felt before. Sarah visited the cabin each day to help him sort through the old documents. They sat on the floor, carefully going through papers, maps, notes, and old books. Some papers were faded, and others were written in handwriting so neat it looked printed. Every item they found connected back to the founding of the town. It was like piecing together a puzzle that had been mixed up for years. "Look at this," Sarah said one afternoon, handing Mark a stack of folded papers. "It's a draft of the town's charter. But this version is different from the one we learned about." Mark read it slowly. "This part wasn't in the public records." "That's the point," Sarah said. "Someone removed it." Mark knew exactly who had been part of that decision, his grandfather and the founder of the town. They had removed details that would have changed how people saw the early days of Alder Creek. There was nothing harmful in the papers, but they revealed choices that were not as fair or honest as the stories people still believed. Mark sighed softly. "People aren't going to like hearing this." Sarah looked at him gently. "The truth doesn't have to be liked. It just needs to be known." "See, Sting." He nodded, appreciating her calmness. She had become someone he trusted completely, someone who understood the weight he carried better than anyone else. As days passed, they gathered enough information to prove what really happened during the early years of the town. They knew they couldn't keep it hidden any longer. They needed to tell people. They needed to share the truth. One afternoon, while Sarah was seated at the table organizing documents, Mark stood near the window, watching the sunlight spill across the yard. "Sarah," he began quietly, "the Founders' Day celebration is next week." She looked up, understanding instantly what he meant. "You're thinking about sharing everything then, aren't you?" He nodded slowly. "It's when the whole town gathers. It feels like the right time." Sarah hesitated, then asked softly, "Are you sure?" "It's a big moment, Mark. People will be surprised. Some will be upset." "I know," he said. "But keeping this quiet doesn't feel right anymore. My grandfather kept this secret too long. I don't want to do the same." Sarah gave him a gentle smile. "Then I'm with you." The warmth in her voice made Mark feel more confident. He wasn't doing this alone. He didn't want to disappoint his grandfather's memory, but he also wanted to honor the truth. Holding both at once felt difficult, yet important. When the day of the celebration arrived, the entire town gathered in the main square. Rows of colorful flags and cheerful decorations filled the air with a festive energy. Families sat together. Children played. And laughter floated across the open space. People celebrated the story of Alder Creek, the tale everyone believed, the tale that would soon change. Mark stood near the edge of the crowd, the box of documents held carefully in his hands. Sarah stood beside him, giving him a quiet, reassuring nod each time he looked at her. She didn't need to speak. Her presence alone gave him strength. When the mayor stepped onto the stage to begin the ceremony, Mark felt his heartbeat quicken. This was the moment he had thought about for days, and before he could overthink it, he stepped forward. "Excuse me," Mark said politely. The mayor turned, surprised. "Mark, is something wrong?" Mark took a deep breath. "I need to say something." The crowd turned their attention to him. People knew Mark as the quiet mechanic who rarely caused a stir. His sudden appearance on stage made a ripple of surprise spread through the crowd. He stepped up, holding the old box carefully. "I'm sorry for interrupting," he said, his voice steady but gentle. "But I found something. Something important. Something that belongs to all of us." Some people whispered among themselves. The mayor looked confused but motioned for Mark to continue. Mark opened the box and lifted out a few documents. "My grandfather. He kept these hidden in the cabin. They tell a different story about the early days of Alder Creek." Sarah watched from the side of the stage, her expression calm but supportive. She knew this moment was difficult for him. She knew he was doing something brave. Mark continued. "The founder of this town did many good things, but there were also decisions made that people were not told about. My grandfather helped hide these details. He kept journals and letters that explain what happened. I believe the town deserves to know the full story." The crowd fell quiet. People listened closely, some leaning in, others gasping softly in surprise. Mark read a few lines from the journal. The words were not harsh or dramatic, they were honest. They spoke of mistakes, missed opportunities, and hopes that one day the truth would come out. He looked at the crowd, seeing a mix of expressions: confusion, curiosity, even discomfort. But no one looked angry. They simply looked surprised. Sarah stepped forward and stood beside him, giving the town a warm smile. "The truth doesn't change who we are," she said gently. "It helps us understand ourselves better." Mark felt grateful she had spoken. She had a way of calming the moment, making complicated feelings easier to understand. The mayor finally spoke. "Mark, thank you for sharing this. History is an important part of who we are. Knowing more about it can help us grow." Some people nodded. Others whispered to one another. The mood shifted from shock to thoughtful interest. Mark continued. "I'm not here to blame anyone. I just don't want secrets holding us back. My grandfather wrote that he hoped someone would understand. I'm trying to honor that hope." The crowd softened. People recognized that his intention was honest and kind. One older man in the crowd raised his hand. "Mark, your grandfather was respected. If he kept this secret, he must have had a reason. But I'm proud of you for sharing it now." Another woman nodded. "It's better to know the whole truth than hold on to only part of it." Their voices filled Mark with relief. He had expected resistance, maybe even frustration, but instead he saw acceptance. The town wasn't angry. They were simply adjusting to a new understanding. The mayor stepped up and spoke again. "Thank you, Mark and Sarah. This information will be reviewed, preserved, and added to our town's records. History belongs to all of us, not just the stories we've been told." Mark felt his chest lighten. The tightness he carried for days began to fade. Sarah smiled at him with pride, and he returned the smile. As the ceremony continued, the mood remained warm. People came to Mark, asking questions, thanking him, or simply offering kind words. He realized something important. Telling the truth hadn't damaged the town, it had strengthened it. Later, as the sun set and people began heading home, Sarah walked beside Mark toward the cabin. "You did something brave today," she said softly. Mark shook his head gently. "We did it together." She smiled. "Your grandfather would be proud." Mark looked at the quiet streets of Alder Creek and felt a sense of peace. The truth was out, the town understood, and his grandfather's burden was finally lifted. For the first time in his life, Mark felt truly connected, not only to his past, but to his future. In the days after the Founders' Day celebration, Alder Creek felt different, not in a loud or dramatic way, but in a gentle, thoughtful way. People walked through the town square with softer expressions, reading the posted copies of the documents Mark had shared. Some stood in small groups, quietly discussing the new information. Others walked alone, thinking deeply. There was no anger or loud disagreement. Instead, there was curiosity, like the town was finally seeing itself clearly for the first time. Mark watched all this quietly from the window of his cabin. For the first time in his life, he felt the town's attention, not because of something simple like fixing a bus engine, but because he had shared something meaningful. And even though he wasn't someone who liked being in the spotlight, he felt strangely calm about it. The morning sunlight streamed through the window as he prepared a cup of tea. The cabin felt lighter now, as though the walls were relieved to no longer hold a secret. The hidden room beneath the floor was open more often these days, and Mark had begun carefully organizing the documents in boxes so the town council could archive them properly. A soft knock came at the door. Mark set his cup down and opened the door to find Sarah standing on the porch, holding a small envelope. Her expression was warm, but her eyes held a thoughtful look. "Good morning," she said with a gentle smile. "Morning," Mark replied. "Come in." She stepped inside, her eyes scanning the cabin as though she were checking on an old friend. "I wanted to bring you this," she said, handing him the envelope. Mark opened it slowly. Inside was a handwritten letter. He recognized Sarah's handwriting immediately, but the content surprised him. It was a note of thanks, simple and sincere. She thanked him for trusting her, for being brave, and for choosing truth even when it was difficult. He looked up at her. "You didn't have to write this," Sarah shrugged lightly. "I wanted to. Sometimes saying things on paper feels clearer." "CM," Mark smiled. "Thank you, really." She sat down on the edge of the old couch. "How have people been treating you? Any problems?" Mark shook his head. "No. Actually, people have been kind. Curious, a little confused, but kind. Someone even came to me yesterday asking if they could help preserve the documents." Sarah's eyes brightened. "That's wonderful." Mark nodded. "It is. I didn't expect people to be so open about it." Sarah leaned back slightly, relaxing. "Truth has a way of softening people when it's shared with kindness." Mark thought about that. "I guess so." Quote. She watched him quietly for a moment, then said, "I'm proud of you, Mark. I know this wasn't easy." Mark lowered his gaze, feeling a warm, humble feeling inside him. "I couldn't have done it without you." Sarah smiled softly, and the room felt warmer because of it. Later that afternoon, Mark and Sarah walked through the town together. The sky was clear and bright, and a gentle breeze moved through the trees. People greeted them with friendly smiles, some nodding respectfully, others thanking Mark for what he had done. One woman stopped them near the bakery. "Mark, I read the documents you shared. Thank you for telling us the truth. It changes how I think about this place, but in a good way." Mark smiled politely. "I'm glad to hear that." After she walked away, Sarah nudged him playfully. "See? People appreciate honesty more than you think." Mark chuckled. "I'm starting to believe that." They continued their walk until they reached the edge of the creek that had given the town its name. The water flowed gently, reflecting the sunlight like tiny diamonds. Mark and Sarah stopped on the small wooden bridge, leaning against the railing. "I remember us standing here as kids," Sarah said quietly. "We used to drop leaves into the water and race them." Mark smiled at the memory. "You always won." "That's because you let me," she teased. He laughed, shaking his head. "Maybe." Their laughter faded into a comfortable silence. The creek's soft sound filled the air. Sarah looked peaceful, and Mark realized he felt peaceful too, for the first time in weeks. "Do you think your grandfather would be proud?" Sarah asked after a moment, her voice gentle. Mark looked at the water thoughtfully. "I hope so. I think he wanted someone to finish what he couldn't." Sarah nodded. "And you did." Mark turned to her. "You helped me do it." She smiled with a warm glow. "I'm glad I came back to town. I didn't know what I expected when I walked into the garage that day, but I'm glad it led to this." Her words made Mark's chest feel light. "Me too." They stayed by the creek for a long while, talking about small memories, childhood adventures, old friends, and the quiet beauty of Alder Creek. It felt like time was giving them a chance to reconnect, not only with the town, but with each other. In the weeks that followed, changes began to take shape. The town council held meetings to discuss the updated history. New plaques were made, schools added chapters to their lessons, and a small corner of the library was dedicated to the documents Mark and Sarah had uncovered. People visited often, reading the journals and letters with interest and appreciation. Instead of dividing the town, the truth brought people closer. They learned to see Alder Creek not as a perfect place, but as a real place, built by real people who made mistakes and learned from them. The new understanding gave the town a stronger identity, one based on honesty and growth, rather than a story polished to perfection. One evening, as the sun set in soft colors over the mountains, Mark and Sarah sat on the cabin porch, watching the golden light fade into dusk. "You know," Mark said thoughtfully, "I spent years trying to ignore the mysteries of this cabin. Now it feels like the cabin brought us exactly where we needed to be." "I would sighed." Sarah smiled. "Sometimes the places we grow up in hold answers we don't know we're looking for." Mark looked at her gently. "Are you going to stay in Alder Creek?" She paused, her eyes softening. "I wasn't sure at first. But now, yes, I'd like to stay. There's still so much to help with. And I like being here." Mark felt something warm settle in his chest. Hope, gratitude, maybe both. "I'm glad you're staying." They sat together as the stars began to appear. Silent, but content. A feeling of calm settled around them. A peaceful ending to weeks of uncertainty. The cabin, once a place of unanswered questions, had become a place of new beginnings. Mark realized something important that night. Truth didn't break their town. It helped it grow. It didn't divide people. It connected them. And it didn't take anything away from his grandfather's memory. It completed it. Alder Creek had been changed, but in the best way possible. People walked with more understanding, more curiosity, and more appreciation for the real story behind their home. And Mark, who once kept mostly to himself, now found himself surrounded by support, friendship, and a renewed sense of purpose. As he sat beside Sarah, watching the last light of the day soften into evening, he felt something he hadn't felt in a long time, a sense of belonging. And in the quiet of that peaceful night, with the cabin glowing gently behind them and the stars shining above, Mark knew that the past had finally settled. The truth had found its place, and the future, whatever it held, felt hopeful.